Airing on Asheville FM in Asheville, this is the Final Straw Radio. This week we're sharing Ian's talk with Samm Deighan, co-editor of Revolution in 35mm, Political Violence and Resistance in Cinema from Arthouse to Grindhouse 1960 to 1990, out September 24th from PM Press. Among other things, they discuss the origins of the book, the benefits and limitations of genre storytelling, the forces that shape movie funding, and where to watch some of the films discussed. Check out our website for a transcript and soon a zine of this chat.
We are welcoming today to the Final Straw critic and author Samm Deighan with the upcoming book Revolution in 35mm, Political Violence and Resistance in Cinema from the Arthouse to the Grindhouse from 1960 to 1990, out next week on PM Press. So hello. If you could maybe introduce yourself to our listeners and maybe speak to your pronouns and your background as it relates to the conversation we will be having.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So, like you mentioned, my name is Samm Deighan. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a film writer, film historian. I work as a special features producer for Vinegar Syndrome. I do a lot of special features for Blu-ray releases. I also write books, usually on more historically focused cinema, so kind of pre-1990. And this is a book that I co-wrote and co-edited with Andrew Nett, who is an Australian writer, film critic, film historian, and we have a lot of other great contributors in the book as well.
So this book goes wide and it goes deep. Can you talk a little bit about the genesis of the book and what your goals were in writing it and how you went about putting it together?
Yeah, so this is something that I've actually been wanting to do for maybe about 10 years now. And I originally envisioned it as a solo book that I would write myself, but I couldn't quite get my head around what titles I wanted to include or what the scope should be, because it really is, as you said, so broad. But I also think that was a really important part of our goal. When I started talking to Andrew about this, he, has similar politics, has done some really interesting books and writing on cinema, but also more radical pop culture. Like he did this great book for PM Press on radical science fiction novels. That's also a really beautifully designed anthology. So very similar in form to the Revolution in 35mm book. But where it really came from is when I started writing about film, I started writing more about genre cinema, specifically horror movies. And I've always had an interest in how violence is depicted in films. And as I started to write about more political cinema, it kind of made me question, how is violence, particularly political violence and radical violence, being depicted in films? What does that look like depending on if it's a mainstream film or an art house film or something else entirely? And so I think the way that we kind of narrowed the scope was we made a list of films that we knew absolutely had to be included. There's, of course, an essay on Elio Petri and Gian Maria Volante and their work together in Italian cinema in the 70s. And they were both really outspoken leftists. There are great photos of them being arrested in protest lines and things like that. So there were some obvious choices, but we really wanted to look at some of the less obvious things to draw some parallels between these different countries, different decades, different genres. And I think we're both so proud of how the book turned out. And it, I think, creates a lot of connections that some are obvious, but some that maybe wouldn't have occurred to people.
I think that there is a temptation, I had a temptation at least, to do two different things at the same time when looking at these movies. One is to look at them as sort of monolithic, and another is to kind of stratify them into these sort of micro streams. Early in the book, you attempt to draw a distinction between art house and grindhouse cinema. My understanding was that these were essentially markets for the films that became context for the films through the lens of history. Can you tell our listeners about the similarities and differences between art house and grindhouse? And further, if it's possible, can you speak to the audiences for each and maybe talk about if there was any overlap.
Sure. So starting off, when Andrew and I made our list of what could potentially be included, something that I knew I didn't want included were big budget mainstream films, because to me, you can't really have a radical mainstream film. And so any depiction of political violence is basically going to be propaganda. And not that you couldn't also apply that propaganda lens to some of the films in our book for various reasons. But so we said, okay, if we're not talking about conventional mainstream cinema, what's on the margins of that? And to me, what's on the margins would be, on one hand, Arthouse films, and the other hand, Grindhouse films. Arthouse films, I think, certainly are at times made for profit. It's still a business, but they're not geared towards a mainstream audience in the same way. They're usually more experimental, playing with form, playing with genre. And I think a lot of the key directors in especially European art house films, East Asian art house films, they're not trying to appeal to that kind of mainstream audience. So I think your point that these terms describe the markets rather than being a specific genre is totally fair. I think art house films usually aim for maybe a more educated, politically aware, or at least intellectually aware audience who's willing to take a chance on a film that isn't just escapism, that isn't just, telling a familiar story in a conventional way. And so Grindhouse, on the other hand, these are films that are also not made for a mainstream audience, but are, for the most part, meant to be this kind of cheap cash grab by producers, not necessarily always by their directors. So that's where you have things like low-budget horror movies and sex films and exploitation movies. And I think the parallel between the two, I don't know that their audiences are totally separate, but I think there's been this understanding, writing about it from an academic or critical perspective, that they are separate, because everyone assumes that the art house audience is that kind of more intellectual, more politically, philosophically engaged audience, whereas Grindhouse people are just, throwing popcorn on the ground and misbehaving in the theater, talking over movies, in there for all kinds of different reasons. Like the typical sort of New York 42nd Street, 1970s and 80s Grindhouse experience, where it was just total chaos in the theater and people were there to have fun. So those films, I think, even if the directors don't always have these kind of conscious political aims, they can get away with so much more because they're not being made for as much money, and there isn't the same type of studio pressure on, okay, well, you can't show this type of violence. Like, they are, generally speaking, much, much more violent films. And so because both of those different markets exist on the margins of mainstream cinema, I think it just allows for so much more freedom in terms of both form and content, especially, for the purposes of this book where violence is concerned.
So they were essentially given freer reign of expression due to, I guess, lower expectations. Is that?
That's a great way to describe it. I think with art house films, there aren't always lower expectations. Like, a really good example of this, which we do cover in the book, is Jean-Luc Godard's film Le Petit Soldat, which was the second film that he made. It's about the Algerian War and specifically people being tortured in the Algerian War. And even though it was partly funded from different sources, it's a Swiss film, it's not a French film, the French government still put their foot down and said, like, no, this cannot be distributed. And so it came out, I think, as either his third or fourth film years after it was made, when it was like safe content. So sometimes the art house films, I think, are subject to more kind of overhead and censure than the Grindhouse films because there are just more eyes on them, because I think there is an awareness, especially in the 60s and 70s, that those films could be money makers. And so because of that expectation of profit, there's more attention being paid sometimes.
Would you say that the studios funding these films, not to oversimplify, obviously, but do they generally have common cause with the filmmakers creating them?
Almost never. I would say part of why we wanted to avoid like bigger studio films is for that reason. So most of the films covered in the book, many of them are independent films. Some of them have things like partial studio funding. Like there's a great chapter from Michael Gonzalez on The Spook Who Sat by the Door, the Ivan Dixon film, which was given partial funding from United Artists because they were going to distribute the film. And they thought it was just this, gangster blaxploitation movie, didn't bother to read the script, didn't bother to look at the dailies. And then when they saw the finished film, had a meltdown and, yanked it from theaters. So I think a lot of the films mentioned in the book, if they were playing for a mainstream audience or had any kind of mainstream theater involvement, there was almost always some kind of issue like censorship or just outright removing it from the theater. So no, big studios never have radical politics.
You're skewing more towards the genre side of things. And if this question doesn't make sense, I can try to rephrase it. But what do you think are the political limitations of a conventional narrative structure? It's an oversimplification, but would radicalizing a bourgeois audience have been the general goal for many of these filmmakers, would you say? I'm thinking of something like Menchet, is that how you say his name? The French noir movies. Hold on one second.
Oh, yes. So this is a tricky question and something that I think, or I've been thinking a lot about because of this book. I do think that some of these directors didn't care at all about their audience. Some of them were being paid to make cheap grindhouse films and use that as an opportunity to put their own politics in, which I think is the case of some of the more interesting grindhouse movies. But then you have counterexamples like Italy specifically. I would say Italy and Japan. I would say in the case of those countries, I think some of those directors making more genre films did put their own politics in, expecting that it would resonate with the audience. And I don't think that's true of every country. So, for example, Italy, and even France, people like Menchet, who you mentioned, and Chabrol to a different degree, who made Nada. But you have these directors who are making spaghetti westerns. They're making poliziotteschi, which are like police procedural crime thrillers. And they're following these genre molds while at the same time including dialogues. Like earlier, I don't think this film comes up in the book, but earlier I was watching Fernando De Leo's Milano Caliber 9. And there's this whole side conversation in a police office where this detective is basically arguing for communism and his supervisor is just like not having it. And so I think that's something that you see throughout so many of those Italian genre films is these politics being slipped in at a time when I think it was meant to radicalize more mainstream audiences, because it was also, politically speaking, a time when audiences would have been more open to it because they were living under this condition of frequent political violence and were thinking about it more. Same thing with Japan. Does that kind of answer your question? That was sort of a rambling answer.
No, it answers my question. And I'm not sure if this kind of overlaps with that, but would you say that there were mainstream audiences for these movies that would have been receptive to them had they, had market forces permitted them to, get into mainstream spaces? Was that at all common for these movies to move from their initial markets into more mainstream markets?
I don't think it was that common, usually because there were these limitations. Like when you think about films like Godard's Le Petit Soldat, which I mentioned, certainly when he made the film, there were a growing number of people in France who were upset about the Algerian War, but felt like they couldn't speak out about it because you could be basically sent to prison, fined, have all these things happen to you, sort of in a parallel with McCarthyism in the US. But I think the films that would have made the biggest impact a lot of the time were sort of pulled or censored, like a lot of the Soviet films and films made in Soviet satellite states that were criticizing totalitarianism, and they were just yanked or had whole scenes cut. Another great example is Choi Hark's Dangerous Encounters of the First Kind, which is a Hong Kong film from the early 80s that he made all about this wave of bombings tied to political protests. And the studio and certainly the government had such an issue with the film that he had to completely reshoot half the film and give it a different plot if he wanted it released at all. And he was like 20 years old when he made it and didn't want his whole career ruined. So he said yes. So I think that sort of goes back to the point I made earlier about how you can't really make a bigger budget mainstream studio film that has real radical politics and real radical depictions of political violence, because there's always some censor interfering.
Thank you. You may have touched on this a little bit in your earlier answer, but in putting this book together, were you looking for a way to talk about these movies specifically, or were you looking for a way to talk about political violence and resistance? I mean, I don't necessarily know if that matters either way, but I feel like it's pertinent.
No, it's an interesting question, because when I first thought about doing the book at all, like I said, when I envisioned it being a solo book, it was because I started to think about how certain films, like some of the new German cinema films like Fassbinder's Third Generation and some of the spaghetti westerns, I started to be more aware of how certain films that seem like genre films, like maybe crime movies and westerns and police procedurals, how a lot of them from the 70s had this surprising, to me at the time, theme of radical political violence. And so I think the idea grew out of starting to think about the fact that there were so many films that did that. But when we sat down to actually put together a plan for the book, the aim was thinking about political violence and revolution and resistance and how that shows up in cinema. Especially, I should say, the book is focused on films made during the Cold War. So it goes from basically mid-50s Algerian war films to around 1990.
Would you say the films highlighted in this book were generally representative of the output of their respective eras, or would you characterize them as outliers, either in their form or their content?
I want to say both, because I think while a lot of the films represent more marginal cinema, there's so much of it. I mean, we could do 10 of these books. Like, this is not meant to be a reference book. It's not meant to be an encyclopedia. And there's so much we didn't get to cover. And so I think because of the sheer number of films, especially made during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it would be hard for me to say that, oh, this is just a thing that's happening very marginally, because it seemed like so many different filmmakers, especially non-mainstream filmmakers, were interested in these themes and were finding ways to put them in their films. So I think both. That might be a frustrating answer, but...
No, I understand. I would expect it's more complicated than this, but do you see a correlation between the size of the nation's film industry and the level of radicalism permitted in their output? And I guess what are some other contributing factors to what is, I guess, permitted to see the light of day?
So when you sent me the list of questions, this one is maybe my favorite, because I don't know if it's the size in terms of sheer number of people in a nation, but I do think there's a relationship between the nation's wealth and what kinds of radical films are being made or not. Because you certainly have countries like some very poor Soviet and Soviet communist countries making some radical films during these little windows when they could. You have South American filmmakers making these films, even though sometimes they were jailed or executed for it. So I think the smaller countries who weren't as wealthy, it was at times easier, I think, to make these kinds of radical films, because the filmmaker Andrzej Żuławski, and this is an issue that's really, really interested me, and I don't think it's featured heavily in the book, but it's definitely something I was thinking about when writing some of my chapters. So Andrzej Żuławski, I covered him in the book because he wrote this film, Devil, from 1972. He's a Polish filmmaker who was forced to leave Poland in the mid-70s, relocated to France, made most of his films there. I think people listening who like cult cinema will probably know him from this movie called Possession from 1981. That's more of a horror movie. But Żuławski, in interviews, when he was asked about, did you leave communist Poland because of censorship and come to Europe where you can make whatever films you want, he would always put people in their place, basically, and would say, like, look, yes, there was censorship in communist Poland, but there's also censorship in Europe and the United States. And if you don't think there is, you're insane. It's just not political censorship spelled out in such literal terms. It's economic censorship, which is more insidious and far worse. So I think a lot of people, especially liberals or centrists or people who think of themselves as not very politically engaged, have this mentality that, like, if you're in a democratic capitalist country, you can make whatever kind of movie you want and it will never be censored. But, like, the reality is your film just won't be made because no one will give you the funding, no one will distribute the film, no one will see it. So it's like, even if you somehow scrounge together money, your film basically doesn't exist. And we do talk about that in the book a little bit with somebody like Robert Kramer and his film Ice, which is very hard to see. It almost doesn't exist. And so I think, to me, that really gets at the heart of this issue of the size of a country and how wealthy the country is and what kind of radical films are being made. It's if it's a wealthy capitalist country, there, I think, is more restriction than if it's a smaller, maybe more politically tumultuous country.
Can you point to the first film, or maybe the first couple of films, in which you saw the political revolutionary potential that is expressed in this book?
Definitely something like Elio Petri's Investigations of a Citizen Above Suspicion. I'm a huge Elio Petri fan, and learning that there was a director who was making these crime films with some really subversive themes, and finding out that, like, he, from a really young age, was a member of the Italian Communist Party and was involved in radical politics even before he became a director. That's when I kind of started to pay more attention to, okay, well, who else is doing that? And another big inspiration for me is someone like Rainer Werner Fassbinder, who made a lot of incredible films. I mean, he made over 40 films, even though he died well before the age of 40. And something like The Third Generation is this really kind of scathing look at the failure of radical politics when it becomes an empty gesture. And definitely a lot of the films that kind of inspired the book are films that also interrogate leftism. So I think, to me, they don't feel like propaganda because they're more complicated.
In your piece on Sarah Maldoror, am I saying that right? Mm-hmm. You write, with Samm Deighan, the film, and much of her later work, Maldoror seems to suggest that a struggle for liberation is not just about fighting and experiencing violence. It's about living within a vibrant community. I found this to be very insightful. Can you talk a bit about Maldoror and maybe talk about how film culture fits into the political concerns of the moment? Is today's film culture keeping up with political developments? And is there a context in which art is leading the way?
So I think Sarah Maldoror is another really, really important figure. And this honestly kind of goes a little bit back to my answer from your last question, which is the fact that I knew I wanted to include films that don't have this kind of black and white trajectory of we're unhappy, we commit political violence and overthrow this government or the state or this corporation or whatever it is we're overthrowing, and that's the end. I think the reality is it's way more complicated than that. And the best films in this sort of loose category really explore, like, well, what comes next? Like, it has to be about more than just revolution or more than just this, one main act of violence. And Sarah Maldoror is somebody who really looked at how are communities involved in changing things for the better. And so it's not just about overthrowing some sort of villainous colonial movement who's there subjugating you and exploiting you. It's also about how does the community work together to lift each other up, but also to inspire things like feelings of hope and optimism, which are honestly absent from, I would say, a number of films in the book. It just, some of them, especially the films made in the late 70s, do kind of feel pretty defeatist. And I think there are a lot of political reasons for that. Like I mentioned, Fassbender's Third Generation. It is not a very hopeful film, but the filmmakers who I think came from Europe, like Sarah Maldoror grew up in France and was the daughter of Guadeloupean emigres, moved to Africa, got involved in different revolutionary struggles herself. She worked with somebody like Pontecorvo on Battle of Algiers. So her training as a young, aspiring director was in some very political cinema. She went to Moscow in the early 60s and studied film there. So she just has the most incredible life story. But I think because she was someone who was directly involved in such a personal way and traveled so much and saw so much, especially in that key period in the 60s where she was living in Africa, making films in Africa. And that's where she made Sambizanga. And I think because she's so much more intimately involved than some of those maybe white European directors who were thinking about this in more intellectual terms, she cared more about what's happening in the community on the day-to-day. Like, that film in particular gives you the sense that these are real people. They're not just these kind of political figureheads who are fighting for something. They're people who are mundane. They have day-to-day lives. They're just regular people. And focusing on that, I think, gives her films this much more emotional core that you don't always see in the more art house political films. Like Godard's films, especially in the later 60s and early 70s when he becomes more radical, I don't think they have an emotional core in remotely the same way. So having someone like her, such an inspiration, I think especially the way she involves communities and women, and it's not just about young men fighting for something, makes it feel like a whole different experience. Does that kind of answer your question?
Absolutely, it does, yes.
18th New York City Orlena Pahoking Anarchist Book Fair is getting close. This year, it's starting on Thursday, September 19th at Pitt, Propriety is Theft in Brooklyn, from 7 to 9 p.m. with Josh McPhee from Interference Archive showing Las Barricadas, 100 years of anarchist music, and we all can dance, dance, dance. Friday, September 20th, doors open at 5 p.m. for the New York City Anarchist Music Festival, also at Pitt in Brooklyn. Then on Saturday, September 21st, between 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., the New York City Orlena Pahoking Anarchist Book Fair will take place at La Plaza Community Garden in the East Village, with more than 60 publishers, many workshops at Blue Stockings, Morris Museum, and La Plaza Community Garden Circle, and an amazing vegan lunch provided by Food Not Bombs. Later, between 6 to 8 p.m., we will have our New York City Anarchist Art Festival with Anarcho Art Lab, Artemis Beast and Guerrilla Theater doing a ritual, Healing a Suicidal Society, and after they will be doing a march with the amazing band Rude Mechanical Orchestra. They will walk performing from La Plaza to Tompkins Park to the Anarchist Film Festival that this year will present films from Palestine, Brazil, and an incredible trailer from Submedia. Finally, Sunday will be our international workshops in person and virtual at Pitt from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., with many workshops from China to Brazil and from Greece to our favorite poet Tongo from San Francisco and other poets from Greece. And to finalize, we will have a reading party at 7 p.m. at Interference Archives. Check our website at anarchistbookfair.net. Just together we can do it in solidarity and anarchy.
You mentioned Gdar, which was, part of my next question. I feel like you characterized Gdar's more politically charged later work as more mature. Do you see these later works as a departure or an extension of the existentialist concerns that marked his early work? And if you could say a little bit about Dziga Vertov Group and how they related to everything else that was going on?
Sure. So in the case of Gdar, I really love him. And what I'm about to say comes from a place of love, and it isn't as bad as it sounds, but certainly an innovator of cinema and especially mainstream genres. But a lot of his films from the early 60s, the energy to a lot of them is like, my girlfriend broke up with me and I'm mad about it. And so they all have these kinds of repeat themes about frustrated love and men who are very frustrated with the women in their lives. And then when he starts making these more radical films, it's like he kind of forgets about himself for a minute. And to the point where with Dziga Vertov Group in the late 60s and early 70s, the way those films were credited was to the group. It was not to Gdar. They were collaborative projects. And so I think it represents a big step for him because he's not just telling these small, emotional, personal stories, but he's concerned with the world finally and what's happening in different countries. Like he wanted very badly, and I'm pretty sure they turned him down because they didn't know who he was or they just didn't trust him. But he wanted to go to Vietnam and make a film, sort of more of a kind of cinema verite documentary type project about communism in Vietnam and the struggle that they were going through. And I don't think they outright told him no, but I think they kind of brushed him off because he had formerly been this Arthouse director making movies about, gangsters and their girlfriends. And having him start to look at the world around him, he had Black Panthers and radical Black activists involved in some of his Dziga Vertov Group films. He got involved with Jane Fonda around the time she became really radicalized. And so because it's so much more of a communal project, it feels like a whole, like you could watch one of his films from the early 60s, like Vive sa vie or something, and then watch one of the Dziga Vertov Group films. And it really is just remarkable to see a filmmaker change that much in less than a decade. Like that doesn't happen very often in the history of cinema. It's really incredible to see. And I think those films aren't always accessible for people because he's basically shouting at you. Like, he's so radicalized and so passionate that revolution is coming and things are changing that he just has no time for anything else, which is the opposite of Sarah Mulder in a lot of ways, because Sarah Mulder does not come from an upper class white Swiss family. She comes from the total opposite of that, and in her day to day is living the opposite of that and sees people involved in these struggles. So I think for her, there's just this more grounded realism. Like I was saying, these are real people and real communities, and how are they supporting each other? How are they engaged in these revolutionary struggles? Whereas Gdar is just kind of like shaking his finger at you a little bit, coming from a place of love and passion because he wants those changes so badly. But it is just such a different approach in a way that I think makes Mulder's films more accessible.
Okay, and the last specific thing that I'm going to try to pin you down on is, can you talk about The Working Class Goes to Heaven? It struck me as sort of a tonal outlier among these films. Is that accurate?
I don't know if I would say it's a tonal outlier, but maybe I just haven't thought about it in those terms, because I've seen all of Elio Petri's films, and when I do that, when I watch a director or a particular filmmaker's whole body of work, it becomes harder for me to separate things out. Working Class Goes to Heaven, I think, is sort of an outlier in Elio Petri's career, in the sense that a lot of his films were genre movies. Like Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion is this really clever twist on those polizioteschi thrillers, in that it shows this high-ranking police investigator played by Jean-Marie Volonté, and he also stars in Working Class Goes to Heaven, was a big collaborator of Petri's, as I think I said a little bit earlier, because they shared the same politics. Citizen Above Suspicion, it's using this genre framework to show police corruption. And that's pretty much what the whole thing is about. It's a really clever, beautifully shot, well-acted thriller. But Working Class Goes to Heaven, I think it feels so different, maybe a little bit more like Lena Wertmüller's films. And she's also a pretty outspoken leftist, making some very angry anti-capitalist films. But Working Class Goes to Heaven is all about this guy who becomes radicalized because he's trying to be the best worker in a factory. And when he gets injured and he finds out that really all his hard work means nothing and no one cares, that's when he starts to look outside the factory walls at these student protesters, and his whole life is transformed, but no one around him gives a and really actively tries to change him back to how he was and say like, oh, why are you getting involved in those protests? It's never going to go anywhere. Nothing's ever going to happen. Like, why are you causing a fuss, basically? And I think it's one of the most relatable films in the book, especially if you're someone who grew up in a kind of maybe middle-class American environment where I think certainly for me growing up, and I'm sure a lot of other people, it felt like, for me, it was very, don't rock the boat. Like, you can be verbally progressive, but not too much. And that's really what he's experiencing, is when he says, like, we should want better wages. We should want fewer work hours, a more realistic work-life balance. People will say, yes, of course, I agree with you. But then when he goes and actually protests, everyone's like, what the hell are you doing? And so it's a film that I think goes back to what I was saying earlier about how the most interesting films in the book question the effectiveness of radical violence and protesting and things like that, which also a lot of the Japanese New Wave directors do, which is why I don't think Working Class Goes to Heaven is as much of an outlier. It's just not a genre film. Does that kind of answer your question?
Absolutely does, yes.
It is a really incredible film, one of my favorites that we talk about in the book. But I always go back and forth on whether I feel like it's a more optimistic film or a more pessimistic film, because on the surface level, it does feel pessimistic, but I think it's coming from a place of optimism. Maybe that's just how I'm desperately trying to read it.
In general, are these films hard to see? Have they been taken up by some of the boutique reissue market at this point? And do you think that there are any setbacks or hindrances that have come from the boutique market in terms of how people watch films? And last part of it, can you speak to any movies discussed in the book that will be easily available for audiences to watch?
Okay, so I would say off the top of my head, probably about half or more of the films in the book are things that you could find streaming online if you're clever enough. Like, for example, YouTube often has a lot of films streaming for free because there are people who know that no big distributors are paying attention, so they upload things. Another channel like Tubi has so much stuff on there. I don't understand how it's legal. It's incredible. So chances are, if there's something in the book that you really want to see and you search either Tubi or YouTube, you'll be able to find it, even Amazon. But it also, I think the book has come out at such a fortuitous time because there is more of an interest in radical cinema and political cinema. Like right now, I don't know how long it will be up for, but while we're recording this interview, Criterion Channel has a whole series on Youssef Chahine, this really incredible Egyptian filmmaker. I wrote about him for the book because he is such an important figure, made all these incredible films in a period where he was able to get away with a lot in terms of Egyptian cinema. And certainly, like, Criterion just released this Ousmane Sembène set. They do have a lot of the more art house films, like they have Le Petit Soldat on Blu-ray. So I think the more art house films you can find through Criterion. Where the boutique labels factor into this is trickier to answer because I think this kind of gets at one of your very first questions about this divide between art house and grindhouse. Boutique labels in general, I think, are more focused on genre cinema because there's such a big audience for it. Like Vinegar Syndrome, who I work for, started off making these, kind of limited run DVDs and Blu-rays of films that were really hard to find. Low budget horror movies, sex films. And we've really branched out since then. So we have put some art house films out. I don't know if we really have much of an audience for the types of political films in the book, unless they're things like, crime thrillers and spaghetti westerns, those more genre films. But you do see some boutique labels, like Kani is a great example of this, Kani. They're based in Hong Kong. They're so wonderful. They have been putting out more East Asian films that I think would count as art, kind of a crossover between art house and genre cinema. They're releasing a new restoration of a Lino Brocca film that's coming to the New York Film Festival. He, of course, is covered in the book. So I think it's a perfect time to be trying to see some of these films. Certainly some of them, if you want to see them, email me and I could send you a file. But I would say probably anywhere from 50 to 80% of them you should be able to find online.
Thank you. So in preparation for this and out of interest, I've been listening to your podcast, Eros Plus Massacre, recently.
Oh, thank you.
I'm not sure if you mentioned it there or in the book or maybe both, but there seems to be a sentiment, a strain that watching films with the maximum level of context is extremely beneficial to the experience, which, it's a pretty obvious statement, but can you maybe speak to what audiences and what people getting into cinema, maybe particularly this kind of cinema, might do to kind of prepare themselves to. I know it's kind of a big question and maybe sort of an ambiguous one.
What can you do to better prepare yourself? So this is
me
like
to be a better audience member, I guess.
Sure. This is a question that I get asked a lot because it's like my entire career is is formed around this question. I think it is challenging because if you grow up, as you know, the majority of us have, if you grow up mostly experiencing mainstream films that are made in a very specific context, like the difference between growing up in Japan and culturally the way they approach cinema versus growing up in America and the way that we expect cinema to adhere to certain conventions, I think sets you up for failure if you're going into these more experimental, art house, radical films. You pretty much need the context. Otherwise, you're like, what the hell am I what am I watching? I think this is a really stupid answer, and I'm sad that I'm saying it, but I feel like the easiest way is after you watch the film, or maybe even beforehand, not necessarily the plot, but just look at a Wikipedia article, look at an Encyclopedia Britannica article, like who's the director? Having that kind of context of what decade a country or a film was made in, what country it was made in, what's the genre, can be so helpful. And I think with a lot of the films mentioned in this book, because there are more art house films, there is a lot of good writing available online. Certainly like Criterion's website and other great websites like Senses of Cinema is a really good one that gives a lot of context for who the directors are and like why are they concerned with these themes, both visual themes, but also kind of plot themes. And I think another way is listening to commentary tracks and listening to podcasts. And I feel like I'm cheating saying that because that's what I do. But I think it is pretty helpful. And this is a sort of a sneaky thing to say, but there are a lot of websites out there that rip commentary tracks and upload them for free, which, my job is getting paid to record commentaries. But I'm certainly not going to stop you if you want to listen to some free commentary tracks because it's like a lecture about the film. And certainly a lot of them have production history, but a lot of them talk about the environments and conditions in which these films were made. And I think it can be really helpful. It's sort of like you could listen to it the way you're listening to a podcast and gain so much knowledge. It's almost like when I script out and plan commentaries, it's almost like I'm preparing like a course lecture is sort of how I think about it.
Final question. Can this era be the era discussed in the book, be replicated? Do the characteristics of today's market make it easier or harder for films like this to be made? And if they do get made, are they easier or harder to be seen? Will the art houses and grindhouses of today just be different streaming services?
Yeah, this is a question that makes me really sad to answer because, I think the answer is probably no. And I'm not a fundamentally pessimistic person, so I want to think that things could change. But something that I thought a lot about when editing this book is how a lot of films, and I mentioned this earlier, how a lot of the films from the 70s do feel kind of gloomy and pessimistic and just really violent. Because I think so many of the intellectuals and filmmakers, people involved in radical politics were so convinced that things were going to change in the late 60s. And when they didn't and just got worse, it was just this huge sense of defeatism. And I think we are dealing with that now. But for me, thinking about it as a film historian, there's this interesting kind of seesaw thing happening where on one hand you have companies like Blu-ray companies, but also different restoration companies who are rescuing these films from obscurity, restoring them and releasing them to new audiences, which I think is a really hopeful thing. Like maybe 2 weeks ago, I went to a restoration screening of The Spook Who Sat by the Door, which, as I said, was pretty much yanked from theaters by United Artists, but also by the FBI, and was kind of lost for decades. Like, you could see it in a shitty bootleg, and there are some 35 millimeter prints floating around. But to see this film at the Brooklyn Academy of Music in this enormous theater with this packed audience, you know, the writer, Sam Greenlee, his family was in attendance, and he fought to have his novel and the film recognized for decades. Ivan Dixon, the director, his family was in the audience. There was this great Q&A afterwards with all these academics. And so it's like, here's this lost film, this totally repressed film being beautifully restored. All this money and time is put into it, being shown to new audiences. It's touring around the country right now. So that makes me feel hopeful. It makes me feel like people want to see these types of films. Whether they're being made is another question. I think there is also some hopefulness there because we just see so much more representation in film now. There are so many more, you know, queer and radical and non-white characters telling so many different types of stories, and audiences want these stories. They want different kinds of films. And so that makes me feel like if you can get more conventional films, more conventional types of storytelling made with maybe non-mainstream compared to, let's say, Hollywood of the 90s types of stories, maybe we can also have some radical politics in there too. Like that Pipeline film that came out recently. I think that is something that suggests that there is hope.
Okay. Is there anything that didn't come up in our discussion that you would like to mention?
I don't think so. Mostly just, you know, I think this is a book that will probably appeal to people interested in the historical documentation of radical politics. While these are all fictional films, and actually that is something that I should say, one of the restrictions we put on ourselves, because we just had to find a way to keep the list of what we wanted to include manageable, the restrictions that we put on ourselves were it had to be made during the Cold War, because those films also feel connected to each other historically in a certain way. But we also excluded documentary films because they just have different concerns. And because of that, something that we really struggled with how to get around but couldn't figure out, there are no Palestinian films in this book. And the reason for that is because most of the Palestinian films made before 1990 were destroyed, seized, and put into a vault by the Israeli army. And so to even find some feature-length, non-documentary films made in Palestine before then is difficult, let alone films to have these kinds of radical political themes that wouldn't have just been, you know, set on fire, is very, very challenging. I hope they're out there and we just don't know about them. But the things that were, I think, excluded, there were good reasons for it, but it's a little bit heartbreaking. So hopefully a book like this will help some of those films see the light of day and get more attention to them. I also think I started with a point that I immediately forgot as soon as I started talking about Palestinian cinema.
That happens. Samm Deighan, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you talking to us.
Thank you so much for having me on the show and for reading the book and having so many amazing questions.
You take care, okay?
Thanks, you too.
Bye-bye.
If you want to support The Final Straw Radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.wtf. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce from each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Venmo, Stripe, or LibrePay, or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies. The Final Straw Radio is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of Anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN, via the links that you can find at tfsr.wtf/support.
KiteLine is a weekly 30-minute radio program focusing on issues in the prison system. You'll hear news along with stories from prisoners and former prisoners as well as their loved ones. You'll learn what prison is, how it functions, and how it impacts all of us.
Behind the prison walls, a message is called a kite. Whispered words, a note passed hand to hand, a request submitted to the guards for medical care. Illicit or not, sending a kite means trusting that other people will bear it farther along until it reaches its destination. Here on Kiteline, we hope to share these words across the prison walls.
You can hear us on the Channel Zero network and find out more at kitelineradio.noblogs.org.
And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
I have a trial date set for September 24th in the Mahoning County Common Pleas Court in front of Judge D'Onofrio. We start jury selection at 9 o'clock. Oh, I'm not on trial. I'm not facing any new criminal charges. Not right now, anyhow. No, this trial, I'm suing someone for defamation. There have been some high-profile defamation cases in recent history. There was the Johnny Depp-Amber Heard case, where Johnny won his case against Amber, and Amber lost her case against Johnny. That just proved that juries won't take a litigant seriously once bowel movements in bed become a fact and evidence, especially if the litigant's last name rhymes with turd. There was also the case of E. Jean Carroll suing Donald Trump, when Trump said she made up her sexual assault claims against him. She won like $1 gazillion. Then after he lost the trial, Trump repeated that Carroll had made up the sexual assault charges, and E. Jean Carroll sued him again for about another $1 gazillion. You can see a pattern there. This defamation trial scheduled for the 24th won't be so monumental. I suspect it will just be a sad and unremarkable end to a sad and unremarkable event. So some context here. I was in a relationship with Snitchy McNasty Pants. Snitchy is not their real name, of course. If their real name had actually been Snitchy, even I would have seen the warning signs there. My relationship with Snitchy doom spiraled and became really inimical. Snitchy scheduled a visit with me just to have me stuck in a holding cage for hours with no bathroom, and later admitted to doing it on purpose just out of spite. Since I'm at the Supermax, Snitchy couldn't poop on my bed. That's one good thing about being here, I guess. When I refused to drop the annulment, Snitchy again retaliated by calling the prison investigator and claiming I had harassed and/or threatened Snitchy over the phone that day. As a consequence of that call, paperwork was shoved into my file, and that paperwork forced me to stay here at the Supermax for an additional year. The parole board will also see that paperwork and conclude that 30-some years after getting locked up, I'm harassing and threatening people. It's not a good look. It goes without saying, but I didn't harass or threaten Snitchy over the phone. In fact, I couldn't have even called Snitchy. Snitchy's phone number wasn't even on my approved call list. I could no more have called or threatened them than I could have flown to the French Riviera. So, you can love me or hate me. You can think I'm someone who would threaten others over the phone, or you can think that it's not in my character. But one thing you can't do, you can't argue with a phone record. And to make it worse, Snitchy is a prison abolitionist who collaborates with prison investigators. I'm not sure, but I think prison abolitionists who collaborate with prison investigators are a lot like vegans who eat meat, or pacifists who are mass murderers. So anyway, fast forward. The only way to get that nonsense out of my file is to sue Snitchy McNasty Pants for defamation. And so that's what I did. Now, my counsel's attempted to get the case resolved, speaking with Snitchy. Snitchy's idea of resolution is to have me sign a contract that promises I'll have no contact with them whatsoever, to include indirect contact, whatever that is. And there's a clause that describes how if we have a future problem, we can have the problem mediated by others. I'm not sure, but I think mediation through others would constitute the very indirect contact that we're promising not to have. Personally, I'm not inclined to have direct or indirect contact with anyone who violated my trust. But I've never understood the purpose of such a contract. If you're dealing with someone who can be trusted to keep the terms of a contract, then you don't need a contract in the first place. And if you're dealing with someone so unscrupulous that you need a contract, chances are someone like that will just violate the contract anyway. But more disturbing is that Snitchy requested a non-disclosure agreement. Snitchy insists that settlement of this case requires that I never speak to anyone about Snitchy ever. I suspect that even this segment would constitute a violation of that non-disclosure agreement. The irony of this is that Snitchy McNasty Pants is the very person who explicitly told me I will never stop them from telling their truth. I guess it's only my truth that's subject to silencing. All of this started when Snitchy made a phone call, and it can be undone by Snitchy making a phone call. But instead, we're heading to trial. I remember when this relationship first doom spiraled, I wondered if any of it was ever genuine. It didn't feel like a breakup. It felt as if the person I loved was never actually real, as if they were never who they claimed they were. And so that didn't just feel like I lost the future, but it felt like I lost the past too. Even the happy memories had a hanging cloud of suspicion and doubt over them. This case for me continues to rip scabs off of old wounds and forces me to wrestle with those same questions over and over again, which I guess might be a good thing. I think I've come to conclude that all of it was real, and it was real because it was real to me. I really felt how I really felt in those moments, and it matters not who Snitchy McNasty Pants really was. I have no control over how others feel or who they become. Snitchy can take a lot away from me, but can't take away my memories of a time when I was happy and loved someone I knew to be the center of the universe. And I have that, no matter how this trial ends. And, however it ends, everyone loses. This is Anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain number A243205 OSP Youngstown 878 Coitesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at SeanSwain.org.
This is The Final Straw Radio. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books. Located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville, Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.